Good evening and welcome. My name is Annette and I am president of the Saratoga Historical Foundation. Before we start, we'd like to ask you to please turn off your mic and video camera because we will be recording the presentation. If you have any questions, use chat at the bottom of your screen. All questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Today's presentation is sponsored by the Saratoga Historical Foundation. The mission of the Saratoga Historical Foundation is to preserve the rich history of Saratoga for the education and enjoyment of the community. We provide exhibits, lectures, scholarships, and essay contests, as well as pioneer living classes for young people. We also produce a bi-monthly 8-page newsletter for members. Be sure to visit us at 20450 Saratoga Las Gatos Road and see the museum in a 1904 building. An 1850 pioneer cottage, fully furnished, one-room schoolhouse, and soon a blacksmith exhibit. We are open Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Our current exhibit is Love is in the Air Around the World. Next slide, please. Some of our future events coming up are join us on March 28th at 7 p.m. Dave House and Jim Cargill will talk about the House Family Vineyard in Saratoga. On April 25th at 7 p.m., Dag Spicer, the curator of the Computer History Museum, will talk about the treasures. This is also a Zoom meeting. An additional lecture will be in May on the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center in Palo Alto, also on Zoom. On April 9th, the Blossom Festival featuring antique cars, live music, crafts, art, petting zoo, food trucks, and more will take place from 10 to 4 p.m. in Saratoga's Heritage Orchard, and it's open to the public. For more events, go up to www.saratogahistory.com. The lecture series is recorded and posted on www.saratogahistory.com. Next slide. It's my pleasure to introduce Jan Adkins. Adkins is a lecturer, educator, and author of several books, including African Americans of San Francisco, African Americans of Monterey County, and African Americans of San Jose and Santa Clara County. She has spent 10 years researching the lives and stories of African Americans living in the communities of Northern California. She was recently named to the Black Legends Hall of Fame of Silicon Valley. It's my great pleasure to introduce Jan.
Good evening. Thank you so much for inviting me to present my research and to discuss my books. This is really quite an honor. So at this time, I'd like to share my slides with you. And I'll begin my talk in just a few minutes after I bring up my slides. Here they are. Okay, so thank you so much. So here's my latest book. This book was actually published in 2019. My first book, so three books have been published by Arcadia Publishing Company. So the first book was African Americans of San Francisco that was published in 2012, then African Americans of Monterey County in 2015, and then African Americans of San Jose and Santa Clara County in 2019. These books are very unique in the sense that these books have over 185 photographs in each book of original images from families, from either historical societies, from museums and libraries. So my books are available at Barnes & Noble, many other local bookstores such as Recycle Books and Campbell, Amazon Books, and Arcadia Publishing Company. You're probably wondering, well, what motivated me to write books about African Americans in the Bay Area? I was like, don't I have anything else to do? Well, I'm an educator, first of all. And what motivated me were my students. That's what motivated me. often we would read books, The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck and other books. And my students would always ask, well, what were Black people doing during that time? Whenever we read something, well, what were Black people doing? You know, we could read Shakespeare, they still want to know what were Black people doing. And I thought that was a really interesting question. And so, you know, I could have said, well, I don't know, which I really didn't know. And so, but I didn't. I told them, I said, you know what, I'm going to find out. We're going to find out. We're going to see if we can come up with an answer. What, you know, was there a Black community? Where did the Black community live? What were some of the activities? How was the community developed? Where was it developed? So, and I know we've all taken history. We've all read lots of literature. And so, and my students, of course, had taken history courses. They're high school students by this time. So we've had lots of California history, lots of United States history, lots of world history, but they still didn't understand where the Black people came from. Where did Black people live? And so they didn't, and it was so interesting because they also did not really understand about the whole Spaniard territory, Mexican American, then the Mexican territory. Didn't understand when they knew when the wars were fought, but they didn't understand how people migrated and moved. They understood the stories of the Catholic priest, Father Juniper Serra, and some of the explorers. They understood that, but they didn't understand how people migrated into parts of California and established their homes. Particularly people of color did not understand how Black people of African heritage established homes, what motivated, what brought people to California. And they really didn't understand how Native Americans, they understood that Native Americans were the Native people, indigenous people lived on the land, but they didn't understand whatever happened to them, where did they go? So the students were left with lots of questions. And of course, who do they turn to? But they turn to their teachers and educators with these questions. So my occupation, I'm an educator. I've taught at the high school level and the college level since about 1990s. I think I have about 30 years in the classroom. I've taught everything from first grade up to, I teach right now at San Jose City College, and I'm an associate professor there. So I've taught not only in California, but I've also taught in Oregon. So these were questions that my students would often ask from various places. It didn't matter wherever. Well, the question, and of course, being an African-American educator, I think the kids felt comfortable asking me, well, where were the Black people? Where did they live? And what did they do? And so I was faced with these questions, and I had to come up with answers. So that was my motivation. So each book discusses the early Black pioneers and how they arrived. So I started out my research with, okay, let's see if we can go back as far as possible to find out who were some of the Black families that came, the early Black pioneers. Why did they come here? How did they come? How did they arrive in California? So each book, so whether it's Monterey or San Francisco or San Jose, that was the first question that I asked, and I began exploring that question. Each book discusses churches and schools, because one of the things I found out when I was working on my master's thesis, which was about the Black African-American newspapers of San Francisco and literature and poetry as published in the newspapers, I began to reading those newspapers, I found out that every community had a church. Well, so you're probably saying, well, yeah, I would think so. But in 1850, how do we know that? And one of the things I found out is that the church was an integral part of the community. The community was focused around the church. And whether the community was a family of six, where six families or more or less, it's somewhere in the community was an association with the church. And so often the churches may have been a white church where they actually attended the white church, or it may have been the creation of a Black church. But wherever there was a sense of church and religion and in the Black community. So with that, and I found a lot of information. And so each book contains a chapter on the first churches and the first schools, because schools went along with the churches. We'll talk more about that when we get into this book. Each book provides statistics about the community. So I provided as I researched as far back, 1850 was the first year of the census reports, 1850, and I was able to include that data. But I was also able to go back further and looking at, in terms of when the Mexican territory, some evidence that we have of the presence from the standpoint of the records that were maintained by the Mexican, those who were in charge, judges and mayors of the first town in San Jose. And Pio Pico, you know, that they were people who were actually maintaining records of the individual families that actually lived in the Pueblo. Each book discusses 20th century trailblazers today. So each book contains information from the first families, the first early families, to the trailblazers and those who opened doors for others in the 20th century. So I tried to cover, I know that appears to be quite a broad range, but I tried to cover not only the beginning, the early pioneers, but into about 1980s, 1990s. Each book has primary and secondary source data and at least 185 photographs from family albums, libraries, local historical organizations, and museums. So African Americans of San Jose and Santa Clara County, as I mentioned earlier, was published in January of 2019. So it contains 6 chapters. The first chapter addresses the life of Santa Clara's Black pioneers from the 1770s to 1900s, and the 19th century, 18th to 19th century. Chapter 2, establishing community through the African American Church from 1860 to 1945. Chapter 3, 20th century African Americans and community building. Chapter 4, the Good Brothers. When you're talking about San Jose, you have to recognize San Jose State University. So under that time, it's called San Jose State College. So the Good Brothers, educational opportunities, and the Black student athlete. Chapter 5 addresses the post-war technology boom and opportunities for African Americans in terms of technology. And Chapter 6, the Black community, creating opportunities for others and opening doors. So to begin with, to start, I'm just going to adjust my screen for a second here. Oh, there we go, perfect. So the African American, the presence of people of African ancestry, we can't say African Americans because of course this wasn't America at the time. So it dates back as early as the 1700s. So that was when people of African ancestry first arrived in the Spanish territory. In 1777, El Pueblo del San Jose de Guadalupe was the first agricultural settlement in the state of California. Of the 21 families who were part of the settlement, 5 were classified as mulattoes, a term used to identify mixed race Afro-Mexican people from Mexico. There's been a lot of research by researchers from Mexico who actually document the ethnicity of many people who were a part of the California development. So in this case, here's the Pueblo, which was considered, the Pueblo was the very first town in the state of California. And so these 21 families came, and what they did was they grew crops. It was an agricultural town. They grew crops to feed the military establishments that were established, installations that were established here in the Spanish territory. And that's what they did. And how do we know they're mulattoes? Well, there's lots of sources but that indicate this. And if you look at some of the records of the early, from the various researchers, you will find that they're the designation of mulatto. And so the next question I had was, okay, well, what is mulatto? And of course, having done some research looking at from how Mexicans classified people, and the Spaniards did the same thing too. So the Afro-Spaniards, in my book, in my Monterey book, I was able to research Alexo Niños, who was one of the very first people of African heritage to come on the ship with Father Juniper Serra, and he was classified as a Spanish. He was classified as an Afro-Spaniard, and so that was a common. And so it was a mulatto. So that was a common term that was used, and that's the way the Spaniards classified people. So they also use the term mestizo, which would say Indian, a mixed race person, mixed race with Indian. So there are other classifications, and the classification for people of African heritage who mixed race was mulatto. This chart that you see on the screen, this is the actual plot designation in the Pueblo. Now, this is actually also available if you go to San Pedro Square. You will see this chart on a large, this map, so to speak, on a large, like a podium, and it's like a, and what it does, it talks about, and there's a nice, wonderful display discussing the first families that came to that were brought from Mexico to the Pueblo, and who actually helped to grow the crops. And so we see the presence of people of African heritage, and that's noted there at San Pedro Square. It's right near the house that is located there. So then my next question was, okay, all right, so we know that people of African heritage came with the Spaniards, came with the Mexicans, and also helped to grow the crops and everything, intermarry and families. Then my next question became, okay, well, what about people after statehood? Because we know that California is a free state, was a free state at the time, was designated a free state in the 1850s. Okay, when California became a state in 1850, became into the country as a free state. All right, so then that was my question. I couldn't quite understand that, because I also was able to find in this case about 3 manumission papers. And I thought, well, if it's a free state, why do we have manumission papers? So if you can see the centerpiece is from, and this is from History San Jose. And so these are the court papers. Here was a man who was, his name was Samson Gleaves, and he was owned by James Finley. He worked in the home of James Finley, and James Finley, according to the census of 1852, had several slaves, and that was how people were classified. I'm like, well, that's crazy, because I remember taking US history, and I remember California's free state, and California didn't have slaves, but that's not true. California had slaves. So what the free state, what that really meant, and as I continued my research on that, I found out that what it meant is that California did not buy and sell slaves in the state, but California did allow the southern plantation owners to bring slaves into the state of California to work, to help build the agricultural establishment, and also to work in the mines and to work in homes. And then the agreement was, though, that they could not maintain them in California on a permanent basis, but that after a certain period of time, a short period of time, and I don't know how that's defined, but I was able to find 3 to 4 years, and then they had to take the slaves out of the state. And so that was what was meant by a free state. So one of the things I discovered, and History San Jose actually owns the original documents, was that there were several people who were, Clem Jackson was another one, who had a certificate of manumission. So what happened is that these people were able to get the abolitionists to support them and get them lawyers, and they were able to go to court and get their freedom. And it was right here in Santa Clara County. The Santa Clara County courts actually manumitted several people. Samson Gleaves was one of them. Clem Jackson was another one. There's another case with 2 children by John Bland. So these were people. James Finley was the owner of these 2 men, and these were people who were able, with the help of abolitionists, were able to go to court and to gain their freedom. And the courts issued them manumission papers. They gained their freedom because their owners, so people who owned them, brought them into the state of California, and the courts decided that they were here illegally, because they stayed beyond the limits of the law, and so the courts released these people. I was so shocked, because the person at History San Jose walked out and said, Jan, there were slaves. And so she had in a folder these actual original documents, the one you see on the screen. And I said, oh my gosh. She said, you want to see it? I said, oh no, I can't touch this. This paper was brown and kind of crumbly. I didn't want to even touch the paper. And then she said, oh my, and she realized that at the point. She's such a nice person. She realized what she's doing. I did not touch those papers, believe me. Because, and of course she sealed and put them back in the sealed casing. But she just wanted me to understand that yes, there were slaves, but yes, you know, the Santa Clara County Court, yes, was able to do the right thing and manumitted several people. The gentleman on the left is in my book, and the reason why he's in my book because he is considered to be one of the first Black men he was a miner who actually located and made Santa Clara County his home. And so his name is James Williams. He was born a slave. He was brought to California as a slave, and he worked in the mines, and his job was to dig at what was called Negro Hill, a mining enclave for Black miners. And he was digging for gold. And he was manumitted by his owner. So the owner made an agreement that if he worked and turned over his gold, he would be able to buy his freedom. So he was able to buy his freedom. And then he moved, and then he traveled then into San Jose and went to Murphy's Ranch. And he lived, and this was around 1852. And he lived and he worked at Murphy's Ranch as a farmer. He worked on someone else's farm. He also volunteered to work. He was a volunteer firefighter for the Hope House Company, a sergeant at arms. But he also was instrumental in helping to establish the first Black church. And he was very well respected in the Black community. But he was able to find his freedom here in California. And he was able to work, and he made California his home. He died here in California in the Bay Area in 1913. He's buried at Mission City Memorial Park in San Jose. So getting this photograph was very difficult. I knew about him because I read about him in books written by other researchers. The book is called Uninvited Neighbors by Herbert Griffin. And he's a professor at Eastern School. And he wrote this book, and it's a wonderful book about the early Black community. And he talks about this man in terms of his service to Santa Clara, the fire department. But so I thought, wow, I'd like to find a photograph. So being that I'm writing a Arcadia book, of course, Arcadia in this particular Image of America series requires lots of photographs. So I thought, okay, I've got to try to find a photograph of this man and see if I can learn more about him. Well, the photographs are actually owned by a family, but the library, Santa Clara Library, was instrumental in getting this particular photograph. I would have loved to have had a chance to know more about him and to look at the other family photographs. But the family who owns the photographs, it's a white family, and I don't know the connection between James Williams and this family, but I wrote them and they would not agree to meet with me, nor would they agree to release any photographs and talk about James Williams. I don't know the significance. I know nothing more about it other than to say that he came here as a slave. He was able to buy his freedom. He volunteered his time until he died. And there was a wonderful plaque that's placed at the headquarters of the Santa Clara County Fire Department commemorating his volunteer service. And he was honored by the Santa Clara Fire Department. And the photograph on the left was a photo of, the next question was, well, what kind of jobs? I mean, did everyone come as a slave? Were there free men and women? Yes, there were free men and women, and free men and women often worked in the homes of other families. White families primarily. And we know this because if we look at the census data, we'll see the listing of the families, but families also included their help, their employees. And I'm going to assume that they were not slaves because the designation of slaves would have been slave. That was a designation used in the census. So, okay, so then, all right, so that answered my second question, which was, who came? Well, we know that free men and women came. We also know that some enslaved people came. We also know that Many people came, and the other category, and why James Williams is also important, is because many came as miners to dig for gold, pan for gold during the gold rush. Some of those miners were in fact free men and women, but some miners were in fact slaves, enslaved men and women, but they were also able to buy their freedom. There are many cases of, in my books, my San Francisco book, as well as my Monterey book, also covers those who were able to buy their freedom. So the owners were willing to give them their freedom if they were able to work their work and pay for their freedom and their families. Okay, so then now my next question was, okay, all right, so we know this is how, and these are the circumstances. So so for those who came, what kind of community was established and developed in San Jose? And so I ran across a person by the name of Peter William Cassie, who was born in Philadelphia. He was a free man, and he came to California in the 1850s at the age of 22. He went to San Francisco, and he actually worked in a shaving salon in San Francisco. In the 1860s, though, he relocated to San Jose, and he was ordained as a deacon at Trinity Episcopal Church, which was the very first church established in San Jose. And this is a white church, Trinity Cathedral Episcopal Church, which was constructed in 1863. So Peter Cassie joined the church, and this particular church had 6 families who also attended church. But the families were in a segregated section, and they wanted to have their own worship, their own place of worship. So Trinity Cathedral Episcopal Church then ordained William Cassie, and as an ordained person, he was able to perform the services for the small Black community. In addition to that, the Black community also was able to develop their own church, and this church was called First Zion AME Church. This church was located on 4th Street. And so this church was founded by John Madden and his wife Charlotte, who are currently buried at Oak Hill Cemetery. So William Cassie established St. Philip's Mission Church. And so this church was a place where the families could go and worship in the evenings at the mission church, but it was also used as a school. So during the day, the St. Philip's Mission was a school for Black children, for Asian children, and for Indian children, and for children from Mexico. So this was a place where non-white children could go to school. And this was operated under the church. Trinity Episcopal Church was mainly they supported this school as well as church for the community. Once the community was able to build its own church, it then created its own church, and it was called First AME Zion Church. And it was the only religious organization for the Black community at this time. And at that time, it was located for 90 years, from 1863, it was located for 90 years at 4th and San Antonio Street. That's where the original church was located. I don't have a picture of the original church, but that's where it was located. And then it moved after 90 years. It was relocated. The church relocated to 20th Street in San Antonio. And I'm sorry, South 20th Street, which is where it's located now. And that's a building that you see in the center. So this is the actual first church. And this is called First AME Zion Church. And right now it's located on 20th Street. So it's still here today. It is a very small church community, but they celebrate their existence for over 90 years. Philip Cassie went on to, once after creating the school for children in St. Philip's Mission, he was also able to create a school called the Fixonian Academy, which is a boarding school for children. And they actually were housed in the Bascom home, and which was on 4th Street, up where the freeway is today, the 680 freeway. It was torn down during urban renewal, along with the old First AME Zion Church. And so Philip Cassie started a boarding school for children, And the boarding school for children lasted until 1870s, late 1870s. In addition to that, he also ran the first Black school for children, and that was called the Colored School. And we'll see that. The photograph on the right, far right, where it says San Jose, Antioch, 1910. So this is a photograph of the next church that was established here in San Jose. It was established in 1893. So this is the original building. It was established in 1893, and it's located. It's located where it's located today, which is on Julian Street in North San Jose. So the first church was in North San Jose. Antioch Baptist Church then was established in North San Jose, and that's North San Jose was where the Black community actually was lived. That's where Black people lived. So in North San Jose, near downtown. And that was the original location of the first community. So in the community, we had businesses. There's a photograph of the first barbershop, and those men were the Overtons, who also they started what was called the Afro League. And the Afro League fought for voting rights for Black men during that time, and they also focused on overcoming the Black laws that were created in the state of California to prohibit Black people from voting, as well as from testifying against a white person. So that was called the anti-testimony law, and that was a law that the state of California said that people of color, so it wasn't just Black people, it's people of color. It was Asians, it was Indians, and people of color could not testify. So this Afro League was very instrumental, along with other organizations from San Francisco and other organizations in the Bay Area, Black organizations that focused on addressing some of the issues of prior to the Civil War, slavery, as well as oppression. On the far right, you'll see, this is from the San Jose Call. This was a sort of like a small newspaper, and they're advertising the school. This was a colored school. San Jose established a school for children. And here's Philip William Casey, who was in fact the principal, and he was also the founder of the school. So this is often advertised. In my book, I actually have some other photographs of some pupils and some other things. Okay, so then my next question was, okay, so what were some of the activities? What were some of the things, and who were some of the people who were outstanding in the neighborhood and the communities during that time? Well, let's go back to the earliest we had in 1873. Edmona Lewis was not from San Jose, but she was a sculptress from the East Coast, from Ohio. And she actually came to San Jose in 1873, and she brought with her sculpture pieces. Here on the far right is the piece of Abraham Lincoln, and there are two other pieces of art. Well, this art was acquired by Sarah Knox Goodrich, and she was an organizer of San Jose's first women's suffrage association. And she bought the art pieces from Edmona Lewis. And then she donated those art pieces to San Jose, to the MLK library. So at that time, it was just a San Jose library. And the San Jose library, this was in 1873, the San Jose library held on to these pieces. And today these art pieces are on display on the 5th floor in the California room at the San Jose library. And I thought that was really significant, because here she was a person who was she was an artist from the East Coast. She was the first Black woman sculpturist, and her work, it has found a home here in California. And from my research at the Smithsonian, it was actually the portrait library. I found out that California is the only location that has that owns all of her art. So the three pieces, I've included them in the book. but these pieces, and I was able to actually secure the photograph of Edmona Lewis from the National Portrait Gallery, from the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. So really honored to travel to try to get a photograph of her. So I'm looking at the artwork in the library and I'm like, where'd this come from? And someone said, you know, that's Edmona Lewis. And that's the librarian said, did you know that? And I said, well, I don't know anything about her. So I had to go to DC, go to the portrait gallery, and I had to do the research about her, find out about her artwork. And then I was really excited to find out that we actually have it right here in San Jose available for public viewing. Well, there were other people too. So I ran across Ivy Anderson in the 1920s when I went to Gilroy to research. I was going to Gilroy to research another family, and I was at the Gilroy Historical Society, and they said, oh, we don't have anything about that family, but what about Ivy Anderson? She's really important to us. And I'm like, really? Who is Ivy Anderson? And so after researching Ivy Anderson, I had a chance to go to a music store, musical instruments and music books in Gilroy. And I'm like, really? What is, and on the wall of this establishment, this business, were pictures of Ivy Anderson. I'm like, what is going on? And they sent me back to the historical society to research Ivy Anderson, and everyone in Gilroy. She is a local person, and people are very proud of her in Gilroy. She was born in 1903. She lived in Gilroy from 1903, from birth till 17. She went to Gilroy High School, and she was a musician. She was a singer, and she also received her vocal training there in Gilroy. And her family lived in Gilroy. They owned a home right across the street from the family, that's from the young man right here in the photograph. Well, they were best friends. Even after he married, she was still maintaining her friendships with him and this particular family. So Ivy Anderson, it was a Porcello family. And so when you go to Gilroy, she was a local hero in Gilroy. So it was really interesting to read about her life. She actually became a famous singer with a famous musician by the name of Duke Ellington. And there's a photograph of George Portello, the family that now maintains the records and lots of photographs of Ivy Anderson. And she traveled all over the world with the Duke Ellington Band. And in my book, I've included lots of photographs of the family. Did release the photographs to me, so lots of photographs of Ivy. And she also is honored at the community college there outside of Gilroy. And so once a year during Black History Month and other times, they also have Ivy Anderson Day, and apparently Gilroy High School honors Ivy Anderson. So it's a local hero. So I thought that was a nice story, wanted to include her in the book because many people from the Black community outside of Gilroy don't know anything about Ivy Anderson, but she is a local hero to Gilroy. Then there's Sam McDonald. Well, he's another local hero I discovered. I discovered that his family worked in Gilroy at a onion farm. And then his dad, this was at around 1890s. And then his dad decided to move the family to Washington. Well, Sam McDonald wasn't having it. So halfway on the road to the state of Washington, he decided to turn around and come back to California. So he wrote about this in his book. He wrote an autobiography. And in his book, he writes about how he was not happy with having to leave California. And so he decided to come back. He was a teenager, came back to California in the 1890s. And he came to San Jose, lived in San Jose, but he also went from San Jose, went to Palo Alto. He got a job at Stanford University, and he worked at the university for many, many years. He died in the 1950s. And at the time he died, he actually owned 400 acres of land, and he donated this to Stanford University. And Stanford University then in 1958 donated the land to San Mateo County. And it's been dedicated for public use, and it's known as the Sam McDonald Park. And at the Sam McDonald Park, there's a lot of information about Sam McDonald, who actually owned the land, in honor of him. He also was a philanthropist in that he supported a convalescent home for underprivileged children. And these were also the handicapped children too. He would go and plant gardens, he would barbecue and cook for them. And he became a real hero. When he died, they renamed the home the McDonald Home. And it is still there today. And if you go on the Stanford campus, they really honor Sam McDonald and his commitment to Stanford. He actually worked as a groundskeeper. He worked in the sports area, and he was also a good friend to many of the athletes. They were able to talk to him, and he was able to, regardless of race, he had created quite a rapport. He was also from his autobiography, he also was the first sheriff of Mayfield. So Mayfield now is a part of Palo Alto, but Mayfield was a small little section, a very small section, sort of like a little town, but it wasn't really a town. It was just a designated area outside of Palo Alto. And this is where Black porters lived. So many people who were Black may not have been able to live in Palo Alto, but lived right outside of Palo Alto, what is called Mayfield. Mayfield today is a part of the city of Palo Alto. And so Sam McDonald was, according to his autobiography, was at one point the first sheriff hired. Okay, it's 7:42, and I see I'm doing a lot of explaining. I'm just going to run through these really quickly and then give you a chance to ask questions of me. So my next area of exploring was the health professionals. Well, who were some of the health professionals? Who were some of the first people to establish their businesses here in San Jose, particularly those from the health or education? And I discovered a woman by the name of Lucy Turner. Lucy Turner was the very first Black graduate of the state normal school. So that was the state normal school, which is now known as San Jose State University. At that time, it was the state normal school. And she was its first graduate. Her family was from San Jose. They actually lived in San Jose and attended Antioch Baptist Church, according to the 1900s census. She graduated in, let's see, she actually graduated in the spring of 1906. She graduated in 1906 from the normal school. And she was graduated in nursing and education. She was a friend of she left San Jose shortly. Her family and her three sisters lived on Julian Street, which was the area that was North San Jose, where African Americans lived during that time. And she eventually moved to Oakland, and she practiced as a nurse there in Oakland. Then we have on the far right, Dr. Leo English, and he established his medical practice in San Jose in 1954. He was the very first doctor to establish a medical practice. He was not able to join a medical practice, so once he was able to rent a home, and this was off Almond Rock Avenue. He was then able to establish in the bottom of his home, he established his medical practice. So he lived upstairs, and on the downstairs level, he opened a medical practice in 1954. He continued practicing until he died a few years ago. We also have the very first doctor medical practice that was attempted was in the 1890s in the home of Dr. Boyer. And that's this house that you see on the far left is the home of Dr. Boyer. And so because he was not able to practice, and so he could not practice because being a person of color, being African-American, was not able to practice his craft. So what he did was he used his home primarily he opened a well-respected massage parlor in the Porter Stock building on First Street. But this was where he and his wife actually lived. His wife went on to start the Garden City Women's Club in 1895, which is a Black women's organization, philanthropic organization. Then in my book, I spent quite a few pages on the chapter Speed City. And so these were some of the young men who actually went and competed in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico. And here they are, some of them today. Actually, this photograph was taken, and they were called, at that time, these were the men who competed. And some of those men actually helped to create what was called the Good Brother Home, which was the very first home where athletes, if they were not able to rent a place to live in San Jose, they were able to live in a home that a group of Black men came together and were able to open a home called the Good Brothers House. And they were able to house many of the student athletes who were not able to find housing in San Jose or campus housing because of the fact that they were Black. And many of these people today, those men today in the photograph, some of them are also in the photograph on the left, and some are they're the same ones in the photograph on the right. And in addition to that, but many of these men became doctors and lawyers and administrators and coaches and have other professions. I thought it was kind of interesting that the group of men, and today they still meet once a year and they have a breakfast, and I attended the breakfast when my book came out to introduce my book. And they talked about some of the memories of the Good Brothers. They were considered the Good Brothers, and they helped to establish a home for other Black athletes that were not able to find housing. And they talk about they continue to support the athletic program at San Jose State. Then we have technology, and there's a lot in my book about technology. The very first Black man to in the 1940s, Roy L. Clay Sr., who came to California. He worked at the Lawrence Livermore Labs, doing top secret work after World War II. And then he went on to work at Hewlett Packard. He worked in the garage at Hewlett Packard. So the chapter on technology opportunities opening doors is about how others were able to open doors for other Black people, so that who had the experience in this training in particular fields. On the far right is a Stanford, Yale graduate and Stanford graduate. Right here, Elroy Smith. Oh, where is it? Oh gosh, I don't know why this is doing this. Let's see, here it is. Elroy Smith is a Yale and Stanford graduate, one of the first African Americans to work as an engineer at IBM between 1962 and 1995. We also see doors were open for women. We have on the far left, Francine Wright Bellison, physicist from MIT, came to San Jose in 1974, and she worked at the she worked at one of the major Fairchild Semiconductor, and she worked as a scientist. And so you see her there with her stethoscope, and she's doing some microscope rather, sorry. I wanted to include this photograph of the house. This is the African American Heritage House, which is in History Park, San Jose. And the purpose of the African American Heritage House is to maintain the local history, the African American history of the African American community. And that's where we document and we preserve our history. And this is, and we have the support of History San Jose with a location for the actual museum, which is underway. And so I think I put this one in the presentation because this is a Black family, the Ellington family. This photograph was taken in the 1940s. And the point of this photograph is that remember to stay connected. And that's one of the aspects of the Black community. Even though there is no longer an intact community, the whole issue of staying connected. That's the point, that Black people in the Bay Area stay connected with each other and try to help support each other and try to promote our history. and our culture. Okay, so it's a 7:50. I think I went over a little bit, but I'd like to answer your questions. Okay.
Do we have any questions? I have one, Jan. I know you're working on a new book, and I thought this is a great time for you to tell us a little bit about your new book. It sounds very exciting.
Well, my new book is, okay, so what I found is that there's a lot of information about Placer County and a lot of information about Oakland and a lot of information about Alameda County and Marin County. And so my book only covers San Francisco, San Jose, and Monterey, but there's the other parts of the Bay Area that are not included. And so I've decided to expand my work and to include those other counties in one book. It will not include as many photographs. It will be published by History Press, and which is more text with photographs. I believe in photographs. I think it's really rich for people to see photographs of what these people look like. If you're writing about someone, we want to know, what do they look like? Do we have some families? What do the families look like? And so this book will have photographs, not as many though, limited to 45 and more text, but it will include the African Americans of the Bay Area. So it will include going east of the Bay.
Were there some commonalities between the people where they lived in each area that you could touch upon?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes, yes. So some of the wonderful stories I read about were when creating the common factors, I think the church, the establishment of churches, as well as the newspapers. So during the 1800s, the very first Black newspaper was created in the 1850s. And these were people who worked with Frederick Douglass and William Garrison on the newspaper on the East Coast, and they came to California and they established the Pacific Appeal, and they established newspapers right in San Francisco. Well, one of the interesting things when you read the stories in the newspapers, they write about San Jose. So they would, and they write about Napa Valley, getting on a horse, riding to Napa, trying to get the news. So they're going and they're going to various communities and they're researching and they're trying to write news stories. And so that was a common factor that, and many of them, there were lots, and I write about that in my San Francisco book. But many of them actually traveled, and there are wonderful stories about San Francisco. So the commonality is that the communities were linked together by the newspapers, by the Black newspapers. And I thought that was an interesting. There's even a story about Monterey, because many people would go to Monterey to work because they could work in some of the businesses down in Monterey. You know, that was a place where the rich people went. And so African Americans would go there and would work. And some of them traveled as porters. They traveled on the Southern Pacific Railroad. And that was in the Black newspaper, how the paper tried to pull together and write about each community, and then share that community news with each other. So that was a common factor, yes.
That's interesting. I see that Ray Cousin has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, the question I have, excuse me, what was the impact of the Civil War and Reconstruction on the Black population in Santa Clara?
Well, the impact of the Civil War was freedom. For those who were enslaved here, the Civil War obviously meant freedom for the enslaved people. The second impact was that the right to vote. So Black men earned the right to vote in the 1800s. And so that created quite a bit of tension between the suffrage movement and the right to vote. But remember, these were only men who could vote. So it wasn't until the 1920s when women gained the right to vote, and that included Black women too. So the impact of the war was the freedom of people of African heritage, the enslaved people, and then Black men had the right to vote after that. In terms of Reconstruction, well, Reconstruction only lasted 7 years, wasn't very long. And then we know that after that, well, in other parts of the country, sharecropping and things like that. And I don't know. I know that if you read, there's a wonderful paper out now about the rural, actually, you know where it is? It's at the Pioneer Museum in San Francisco. And they've done a complete study of Africans in rural California. And so that's where you see those who went into farming and agriculture, of the impact of Reconstruction, you know, post-Reconstruction, actually it's post-Reconstruction on the agriculture of San Jose, of California, not San Jose, but California. But other than that, the Black community just continued to thrive and prosper and develop. The community was very small, and I include the statistics in my book, but that was for San Jose and Santa Clara. But if you look at statewide statistics, the number of Black people was still very small until World War II. And by World War II, because of the war industries that were located in California, that attracted a lot of people. During the Great Migration in World War II, came to California to work. Black people came to California to work in the shipping industries. And then after World War II, when technology boomed, then you had again an in-migration of Black people. The population of African Americans, as you know, is still very small, but many people who have migrated here migrated because of technology and or job opportunities, job opportunities, post-war opportunities, and the technology boom opportunities.
Thank you. Gail Huggins sent you a message. She says, thank you so much. Your talk and pictures are wonderful. My daughter's birthday is this week and she is interested in local Black history. So we'll be going out to get your books for her tomorrow. Thank you.
Oh, great, great. Yeah, you can find my books at the Recycle Bookstore in Campbell, and also Barnes and Noble down on Blossom Hill may have them, and if not, they're available on Amazon or Arcadia Publishing Company.
And I see my daughter is on here.
Oh, your daughter's, hello.
So now she knows she's getting a book.
How old is your daughter?
I don't know if I should tell.
Oh, okay. You don't have to tell me, but is she in school?
Oh no, she's married.
Oh, she's an adult. Well,
Yeah,
no, that's important though, because you know what? She can share this. It's like a coffee table book. You can put it on your table and she can share with her children.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes, that's what we do. I have grandchildren. I share, but they have me coming to their school. I have to give talks at their schools. I love it. I help their teachers augment the California history section.
Oh, there's my daughter right there.
Hi.
Hi, yes, I am the daughter and I am very interested in, yes, I know it. I'm very excited to get your books for my birthday present. But I do have a question for you because I am an early childhood educator at Santa Clara University for staff and faculty. Would you have any interest of approaching this from a younger child, like doing books for younger children?
Oh, I know. You know, I will be honest with you. I don't think so.
Okay, okay.
There are lots of writers out though that Black writers who are writing children's books. But I'll tell you that my books actually, the reason I like this style is because it includes lots of photographs, and the books they can be used in elementary school when they begin studying California history and California. These books are useful because there are lots of pictures. And even though a person has to read to them, still, I think kids can grasp the understanding. Yeah.
And I can paraphrase.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I've actually been working on our library. That's been one of my things at work. And there's been wonderful things that are in the Bay Area, like Embrace Race. So if anyone listening with children or grandchildren, I highly recommend Embrace Race and look it up online for the youngers. But yours would definitely, if I just paraphrased and like you said, showed the pictures and just kind of made it age appropriate language, you know, easier to understand, I will definitely do that.
Right. Because our history that is taught is very Euro. Thank you. The history that is taught is very Eurocentric, and we have to ask the question, there were native people that lived here. Where did they go? And we don't have answers. We don't know. I mean, our books are, you know, we can assume they died, this and that, and whatever, but there were so many. There's got to be answers. So we need to read the history of the various cultural groups to find out, and not just people of color, but there are other cultural groups that lived and had set up community, established community in San Jose and Santa Clara County. And what happened to them? The whole story of the Chinese villages that burned down. That is a story that needs to be included in California history.
Yeah.
You know?
I absolutely agree. And I'm happy to be a part of a community of staff at the university where we're really trying to address those things and broaden the literacy that our children are exposed to.
Good.
So thank you so much.
Yay. Thank you for your work. Sounds exciting.
It is. I'm really excited about it. And this is wonderful being a part of this and listening to you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? If not, Jan, it was just a really tremendous presentation. It was so interesting. I own your book and I really enjoyed reading it. And I know you said you're going to come to the Blossom Festival and sell books.
I am. I'm going to come. Yes, I'll talk to my friend and Robin. But I'm going to come anyway. Yes, I'll be there. Absolutely.
So it'll be great for people to see you and be able to ask you questions in person.
Yes, and I'll have all of my books at that time.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you again very much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Jan.